I'm presenting the results of a review I carried out for DOC of their pest fish removal program, which has been going for the last 13, 14 years or so. So the Serpentine lakes are the remnants of a larger lake which has been drained. They're fairly shallow lakes. They're peat-based systems, and they've got a fairly small pastoral-dominated catchment. All of these three lakes are eutrophic, although they do retain these really significant macrophyte populations. But we do get some stratification and deoxygenation of the bottom waters in summertime and autumn. So they're all fairly well connected through their marginal wetland areas, which you can see pretty well on this map. And the east, south and north lakes all drain into this area of sort of wetland, which is submerged in wintertime, called the Winter Lake, and then that drains out to Lake Rotopiko and then the Waikato River. And on this photo here, you can see the margins of these lakes have been planted up and restored over time, and there's been a lot of restoration gone on in the margins and in these lakes over the last decade plus. This is a multi-agency effort, including the predator-proof fence, which you can see here. It's just been installed around East Lake, and it's also a pest fish-proof fence, which I'll touch on a little bit later on. There's been a lot of riparian margin planting. There's been a weir constructed at the lake outlet, which John Gumbley's talked about earlier, which was designed to maintain those water levels to stop peat shrinkage. Pest fish barrier, which John talked about as well. There's been weed control, terrestrial weed control, trials of silt and nutrient traps. Also looking at integrated catchment management options such as whole farm environment plans, and there's been some research support and biosecurity surveillance going on in these lakes. And the fish population is mainly indigenous, and these are recent results from a study carried out by the University of Waikato. So after all this netting has gone on, bear in mind that most of the biomass is made up of indigenous species. Shortfin eel is the greatest component of that. We also have longfin eel, common bully and common smelt, which were introduced into the lake sort of around the 1970s or so. The non-indigenous fish population is comparatively small. We've got goldfish, catfish, rudd and gambusia, which have only just been found in the lake in the last few years or so. And why all this intensive effort? There's some really ecologically important populations of submerged macrophytes in these lakes, so quite rare for the Waikato. We've got native Potamogeton species, also charophyte meadows, which are doing really well, more or less, despite these eutrophic conditions. And so we have had an invasion of Utricularia gibba, which is an invasive bladderwort species. You can see these taller stalks here growing in this charophyte meadow, and that's been fairly recent within the last few years as well. So the pest fish monitoring program was kicked off in 2001, and the aim of that was to protect these native plant populations and also to improve fish populations as well. So rudd have been the main target of this program, and that's due to their documented effect on lake macrophyte communities. They're herbivorous from the time they get to around 15 centimetres long or so. And there have been some previous studies in Waikato lakes, such as Rotopiko and Rotorua, which have shown that if you exclude rudd from establishing macrophyte populations, then you're going to get better results with macrophyte growth. But we were a little less clear on what their effects are on established macrophytes, but we'll be going into that a bit more in the course of the talk. So the main netting methods have been using monofilament gill nets, and they've varied a little bit over the course of the program, and that's because the goals of the program have varied over that time as well. There was some really intensive netting at the start just to get those populations down, and since then, in the last few years, it's actually been reduced to one night of netting every year, and that's just because the populations are now so low that it's more of a monitoring effort as opposed to a population reduction effort. And so a way of looking at these results over time is to look at the catch per unit effort, and that's just the number of fish caught standardised by how much fishing was done. And so for this study, we're looking at how many nets and how many nights they were set for. And in the following graphs, I'm comparing the CPUE during the first night of netting, just so you can get a relative idea of what the populations are doing between years. So at the same time, macrophyte surveys have been carried out by NIWA, and they use the lake spy method, which is a composite measure of all kinds of different measurements taken and takes into account native and invasive species. And they also do sonar profiles of the macrophytes every year, and that project is led by Mary Dillington. So in the East Lake, since 2001, there was quite a dramatic reduction in rudd numbers when they first started doing the netting. Since then, rudd have sort of only been found in very low levels. That's them with the green line there. And quite encouragingly, in the last 3 years of netting, they haven't caught any rudd. And then the prior 4 years before that, they only caught one in that whole netting time. So we've got a few different things going on with the catfish. Their numbers have fluctuated it a little bit. But bearing in mind that the fish CPUE through this whole effort in this lake has been really quite low. So looking at what's been going on with the plant populations during that time, pretty stable all throughout the early 2000s. So bearing in mind that we don't really have before data, so what was happening before they took the fish out, but certainly afterwards we've got a very strong healthy macrophyte population up until this invasion of that Utricularia species, which has led to a reduction in cover and density of the native species. So bringing back those fish results, not really sort of any clear indications that there's a relationship there. Of course, our rudd densities in this lake have been very low that whole time. So in the North Lake, bit more fluctuation going on with the fish populations here. We had an initial reduction in the rudd populations, and then they sprung back a bit in the mid-2000s. How does that compare to the macrophytes? Don't seem to have been too bothered by that increase in rudd populations in the middle of the decade there. And again, we're seeing that invasion of Utricularia fairly recently in the North Lake. So yeah, just bring back those fish population results there. So for the South Lake, a bit of a different pattern going on here. Had a quite steep decline in the rudd populations initially. They've tended to remain fairly low after that initial intensive effort. We have seen a gradual increase in the catfish populations in this lake, which have the potential to be causing some effect. South Lake is a little bit different to the other lakes in that it has cycled through these periods of being completely devegetated. So the macrophyte populations have crashed a couple of times, and then they've managed to re-establish themselves. We can also see that Utricularia invasion down here. So again, quite difficult to look at any clear relationships there. So to look at that further, I tried doing a few correlations. So I looked at the lake spite index and the CPUE of all fish species, the CPUE of rudd. I also looked at the lake spite index and the number of rudd that had been removed in the previous 12 months to see if those populations or the removal was perhaps related to the cover or density of the macrophytes. I also thought maybe the efficiency of the gill netting was being influenced by some other variables such as lake turbidity. So maybe if the lake was more turbid, the fish wouldn't be able to see the gill nets and would get caught. So yeah, looking at some Waikato Regional Council data to work that out. To cut a long story short, there weren't any relationships among any of those variables, which I found really interesting actually. And thinking about it, I think the reason for that is probably because there hasn't been much variation in the actual rudd density after the early 2000s, which suggests that this netting program has been really effective in controlling that rudd population down to an ecologically effective level. The other thing is that there's confounding variables such as the invasive macrophyte species invasions. Also, you've got these other lake processes which are going to have very strong influences on the macrophytes, such as turbidity, phytoplankton levels. Self-shading of macrophytes is another one. So, and Mary De Winton was telling me about this, in that the macrophytes will actually start inhibiting their own growth at a certain density because they'll be shading out the lower levels so that the light availability is less. And when you've got really healthy macrophyte populations such as these, the rudd at their low densities might actually be having a somewhat beneficial effect in that they're just sort of trimming the hedges, cutting down that self-shading, but they're not really doing enough damage to the macrophytes to really cause any difference. Now, under less favourable growing conditions, of course, then those rudd do have the potential to severely limit macrophyte growth and also prevent re-establishment of macrophytes if you're trying to restore a lake back to a vegetated state. So yeah, some interesting issues there. So moving on to what's happening with the native fish. So Doc did a native fish survey back in 2006, and there was also the one done by University of Waikato, which I mentioned earlier. Both of these have really shown that the population in the Serpentine lakes is really healthy, really good shortfin eel population, and there's no harvest of shortfin eels in this environment, so you're getting nice mature fish. When you compare it to other lakes which are fished, such as Lake Whangapai, we're getting a much sort of size structure that's more indicative of a mature, pristine population. So if we look at the bigger picture and compare the native and pest fish biomass in Serpentine compared to other lakes around the Waikato, this is some data from the University of Waikato recent surveys. And so looking at Serpentine down here on the right, we've got quite a significant shortfin eel population here. Really negligible populations of pest fish, especially compared to these other lakes, a lot of which are a lot more connected, therefore have more potential of being invaded, especially looking at Ohiniwai, which initially had that really huge biomass of koi carp. So in conclusion, it seems from this evidence that the netting has kept the pest fish at a very low level that doesn't seem to be having any significant effects on the macrophytes. However, it's a little bit difficult to draw definitive causal relationships between the pest fish and the macrophytes with the data that we have at the moment. Same sort of story with the effects of native fish, seems to be having a positive effect. So there are a couple of additions to the monitoring program, or modifications, which might sort of streamline things a little bit. And one of these was potentially cutting down the frequency of monitoring to every 2 years, just because the populations seem to be stabilised at a fairly low level. But exposure experiments are an option that would really definitively prove or disprove whether the pest fish were having an impact on the macrophytes as they are at the moment. So these have been done in other Waikato lakes, although these experiments were a little bit different in that they looked at establishing macrophyte populations rather than existing populations. Excuse me. So a small limitation of this kind of work is that this would tell you about the effects of pest fish as a whole, but wouldn't necessarily tell you about the effects of individual species unless you started manipulating the actual fish populations around the exposures, which probably wouldn't want to be fiddling around with too much in the Serpentine lakes. So another opportunity for further restoring the fish populations in these lakes is this predator-proof fence. So it kind of goes around these marginal wetlands bordering the East Lake, and at the moment it's a barrier to all fish, but a provision for passage has been provided for in a trap box which has removable panels, and so can be modified to allow passage during different times of the year. And so with the red populations in East Lake already being next to nothing, this means that the potential for reinvasion into this lake is fairly low. Okay, and with that, I will thank people who have helped me with the report and provided data. And there's a full report that's coming out in its final version in the next few weeks. So if you're interested in hearing more about that, get in contact with me or John Gumbley.